Good evening. Welcome to Precious Blood Renewal Center in Liberty, Missouri. The Renewal Center is a safe and sacred place offering healing and hope, renewal and reconciliation for all people. And that's our mission statement. And it's with that idea that we offer programming such as what we have tonight. This isn't your mother's church. Will it be your grandkids? Hope it stimulates a little discussion and maybe hope for the future. We want to thank you all for coming. Just a few logistics here for people in the room and joining us through Zoom. If you're here, we've got snacks and beverages back behind you there. Please help yourself. Restrooms are over this way behind us. There is one back through there if you need that. Make yourselves at home. The heat wave has broken in Missouri, so it's a pretty cool evening, and there should be a little bit of daylight left after the program. If you want to take a walk through the up to our labyrinth or around the pond, you're more than welcome to do that. Make yourselves at home. Enjoy a little bit of the nature and the coolness while it lasts. Zoom people, a couple of notes for you all. You will all be muted throughout the discussion tonight or through the presentation until the discussion time. And so if you don't mute yourself, I'll be doing that when I'm in control at the back of the room. So it just makes it all easier for all of us. We are going to have, after the formal presentations, we're going to do about a 10-minute breakout group. So the people in the room here will just stay at your tables. People in Zoom, I'll automatically move you into rooms. And so you can have about 8 minutes of discussion, and then we'll bring you right back for question and answer time. Our sound system is wired so people in Zoom can hear us. If you don't have a microphone, you're not going to be heard. So for the question and answer period, Father Ron will and I will be in the audience to pass things out. Don't speak until you've got the microphone in your hand, or the Zoom people won't hear you. Zoom people will have you projected up on our big screen for that time. And if you want to speak, just kind of raise your hand or flap a little bit and we'll recognize you as best we can. Okay. Thank you all again for joining us tonight for this presentation. Our presenters, I think, are very experts in this talk through study and through a lot of experience. Our first speaker here is Father James Smith, Precious Blood priest, graduate student in practical theology from Graduate Theological Union in California. Father James is born, raised, and lived in Indiana until he entered formation with the Precious Blood community after graduating from St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana. He was ordained in 2017, and his research interests include theologies of pastoral care, practical theology, and trends in American Catholicism. Responding to Father James will be Jennifer Greene, Jenny. Jenny grew up in Kansas City. He married Dennis Greene, who's sitting beside her. They raised 3 kids in Visitation Parish, Midtown. After finishing a master's in ministry from Creighton University, she taught theology at St. Teresa's Academy for 10 years and then transitioned to parish work last year. And when we asked her to be the respondent for this, her response was, having watched my own children's relationship with the church and hundreds of teens over 10 years, I urgently want to be a part of this conversation. So that's a good place for us to get started. So I will turn this over to Father James. Thank you.
I want to start with something a little bit outside of the paper for this talk. I want to start with Brene Brown, a very brief video from TikTok from one of her many presentations she's done over time. I think this is good advice when leading into a conversation about the future of the church and sort of the affective dynamics of this.
Someone asks me to do something now, I spin my ring 3 times before I answer. And it's my boundary ring. And what I say to myself when I'm spinning it is very simple. And it's choose discomfort over resentment. Renee, can you bring 5 dozen cookies to school tomorrow? Nope. What happens when we say, sure, I'll be glad to bring the cookies up to the school. Like, if you know me, you know I'll go right into my very high voice. Sure. I'd love to. And then what happens is you're home in your kitchen and your kids want you to be kind and gentle with them, but you're like this. I hate these people. I hate these kids. I hope they choke on my cookie, you know? So how do we do things without resentment, you know? And it takes boundaries. So in the end, I think if we take away anything from the authenticity piece, it is about the courage to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, and to set boundaries. Because the whole idea of I am enough starts with enough.
Choose discomfort over resentment. It's a good idea. At the beginning of Sense of the Faithful, how American Catholics live their faith. From 2009, Jerome Baggett, a sociologist of religion who teaches at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University at Berkeley and at GTU. He quotes a parishioner from Most Holy Redeemer. Quote, "The thing about American Catholicism is that it both exists and doesn't exist." What do I mean by that? I mean it exists in the sense that it's an it, something you and I can talk about and we can identify elements of it and so forth, but it doesn't exist as some monolithic, unchanging thing. It's not as if any one person understands it and lives it out the same way all the time or in quite the same way as anyone else. These are photos from MHR in San Francisco, where missionaries of the Precious Blood have been serving now, I think for almost a decade now. On the other side of the continental United States, Alyssa Maldonado Estrada writes, in Lifeblood of the Parish, Men and Catholic Devotion in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, quote, "Devotion is not simply about intimate connections to the saints, but contributes to the very construction of masculinity and authority in religious communities. Angry, disaffected men, empty pews, and shuddering parishes define this contemporary moment in discussions of American men and discussions of the Catholic Church. In a time when scholars and journalists alike agree that there is a growing malaise among men and that the Catholic Church is in crisis, I argue that churches continue to be vital sites for the making of masculinity." End quote. My reflection today sits in between the two of them, both geographically and conceptually. There's a type of crisis in the Catholic Church in the US, the one that gets overstated by many. There is also an ambiguity in what American Catholicism is, or more pointedly, who counts as belonging inside of American Catholicism. To get a gauge of where we might be going in 40 or 50 years, grandkids church, so to speak, it is helpful to take a step back and see where we have been and where we are. After this foray into one part of recent American Catholic history, I will turn to the history of tomorrow. However, there's a caveat to these 2 points of reference, the past and the present. For both, there can be a type of nostalgia, a feeling of what was or what is, and not an accurate representation. In one of the BBC Reith lectures, Hilary Mantel, author of Wolf Hall, stated, "Evidence is always partial, facts are not truth, though they are part of it. Information is not knowledge, and history is not the past. It is the method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. It's the record of what's left on the record. It is the multiplication of the evidence of fallible and biased witnesses, combined with incomplete accounts of actions not fully understood by the people who performed them. It's no more than the best we can do, and it often falls short of that. Our gauge of the past and the present is partial and not the full truth. especially when clouded by a nostalgia of self-aggrandizing. A gauge of the history of the American Catholic Church will fall short, but since we're here, let's move forward to the past. I want to start with the points of comparison today-ish, 2022, and nearly 40 years earlier with 1985. I'm indebted to data information from Cara at Georgetown University. I chose 1985 because I was born in 84, and so that's my lifespan. It also is a nice window to the millennial generation. In the past 40 years, there have been significant changes in the US church. At the surface level, we might be inclined to consider these shifts as a decline. Quite a bit of the numbers show a decline. In 1985, there were roughly 19,000 parishes in the US. Today, there are roughly 16,000. The number of priests has dropped 23,000 from 57,000 in 85 to 34,000 today. In religious orders, the number of priests has more than halved from 22,000 to 10,000. The sharpest decline of all has been in the number of women religious, from 115,000 in 1985 to 36,000 today. There were 178,000 in 65. Catholic schools have followed these numbers. The number of students in Catholic schools has substantially dropped. 2 million, from 2 million to 1.2 million in Catholic elementary schools, 775,000 to 525,000 in Catholic high schools, and 830,000 to 400,000 in religious education for high school students. Even the number of Catholic colleges has dropped from 243 to 220. I think some maps are helpful here to take a look at the nation as a whole. For this map, the yellow dots are Catholics, the purple dots are Baptists, the red dots are Lutherans, Methodists are green, Latter-day Saints are blue, Churches of Christ are brown, and other is, I think, a white dot. This is by county, just across the United States. This is the main religious family by county. Another gauge of the scatter plot Christianity in the United States. This last map I like a little bit more, actually. This is a gauge of religious diversity in the United States. If we collapse all Protestants and Catholics into the same religion. One of the things I love about this map, outside of New Mexico and Colorado, this map looks very similar to urban density, which I'll get to in a moment. However, these declines tell a part of the story. The number of Catholic colleges has declined. The number of students at Catholic colleges or universities has increased during the same time, from 544,000 to 700,000. The number of parishes in the US has dropped 3,000, roughly 400 every 5 years, but none of that decline appeared until the year 2000. We look at the number of parishes by region of the country over the time period. We see a steady decline in New England, the Great Lakes, and the Midwest region, but an increase in the Atlantic South, urban parts throughout the central region, and a constant steady increase in California. To borrow from Southwest Airlines, you are free to move about the cabin. Applies as equally to American Catholics as Americans and where they're moving, working, and living. The most shocking data on Catholic institutions and shifts in the US is probably in Catholic healthcare. The number of Catholic hospitals in the past 40 years has declined from 630 to 520. However, the number of people served by Catholic hospitals in the past 40, however, the number of people served by Catholic hospitals for their primary care has almost tripled from 36.4 million to 84.4 million. According to the Catholic Healthcare Association of the United States, 1 in 7 Americans finds their primary care at a Catholic hospital. In my home state of Indiana, St. Vincent Hospital, and now Ascension Health, bought out dozens of community hospitals which had gone under. My home county's hospital declared bankruptcy one day and closed, and reopened the next day as a Catholic hospital. Without the purchase of small rural county hospitals, dozens of Indiana counties would have been without a hospital. Not all Catholic institutions are in decline, and those whose numbers are shifting raise the question, what counts as decline? Is it just the numbers? Is it the collection baskets or budgets? What role does quality, not just quantity, have in describing change or continuity in American Catholicism? Before diving too deeply into qualitative data, I think it's helpful to take a different angle at quantitative data at the U.S. Catholic Church. Instead of looking at decline or growth in institutions, a perspective of younger American Catholics today is helpful and instructive. I think to putting this decline growth dialectic into perspective. There are three major points about younger American Catholics. They are growingly diverse ethnically and culturally. They are more liberal or progressive on social issues compared to older American Catholics. And there is likely a point of no return on cultural shifts on younger Americans and likewise American Catholics. First, let us look at the growing diversity in the U.S. Catholic Church. There is good news and there is better news. The good news is that the Catholic Church in the U.S. is in decline. That was a mistake. Let me rephrase. The good news is that the white Catholic Church in the United States is in decline. The United States across the board is growingly less and less white majority. For example, in the group of Catholics under the age of 30, only white Catholics have less than 20% of the white Catholic population under the age of 30. For Black Catholics, Latino Catholics, and Asian American Catholics, more than 60% are under the age of 50. The majority of non-white Catholics is under the age of 50. The average age of white Catholics is far older than every other ethnic group in the U.S. Catholic Church. To reverse it, the average non-white Catholic is younger than the average white Catholic. For Catholics under the age of 30, the number of white Catholics is identical or slightly less than the number of Latino Catholics. Under the age of 18, Latino Catholics are a majority. What was once a projection for 2040 or 2050 of Latino Catholics as a majority is a reality much faster than imagined. The age and ethnicity angle of American Catholics is a helpful and necessary angle when considering changes in religious orders today, both men and women. If there is a decline in white Catholics in the American Catholic Church, which there is, then it would be reasonable to expect a decline in religious orders if these orders retain and maintain white cultural structures and frameworks. More specifically to younger Catholics, what do they look like? Younger Catholics are more liberal or progressive on issues. These issues range from abortion, size of the government, the environment, and sexuality. A recent study found that 15% of Gen Zers self-identified as bisexual, more than doubling any previous generation's numbers for self-identification as bisexual. 1 in 6 Gen Zers self-identify as LGBT. Notably, the US and the North American report submitted to the Synod on Synodality, I believe, was the first official document from American Catholic bishops to reference LGBT in the text of a document itself. In both directions on the subject of sexuality, embrace or engagement, and restriction or prohibition, there is sizable energy in the US Catholic Church to address diversity. One of the invited speakers at the Eucharistic Congress this summer has promoted reparative therapy, for example, for LGBT persons for decades. It is also incredibly important to situate where younger Catholics are and where they have been. All Catholics under the age of 40 have no memory of the liturgical reforms after Vatican II. Advent 1968, first implementation of the dogmatic constitution on the sacred liturgy. Advent 1968 was 27 years before I was born. Catholics 40 and under are generationally removed from the liturgy wars, which defined the ecclesiology tension in the US Catholic Church in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s. For those reaching back to a tradition in the liturgy today, it is not a tradition in which or from which they have personal experience. It is nostalgia for something they have not experienced. For example, the Roman canon from Cardinal Cushing at President Kennedy's funeral could be described maybe as more fluent in the Boston accent than in Latin. I was shocked when I saw that for the first time. Likewise, younger Catholics do not have a point of reference before Boston 2002. The sex abuse cover-up crisis, which exploded in Boston in January and February 2002, with more than 40 consecutive days of front-page coverage of the cover-up scandal, is one of the fundamental lenses when looking at American Catholicism today. The fact that Boston Globe Spotlight Team's reporting was put on hold due to September 11, 2001, should help emphasize 2 points on younger American Catholics: instability and a loss of credibility. There is an instability in authoritative institutions around younger Americans, and there is a loss in the credibility of people in authority. For American Catholics, the second point is compounded by the revelations in the then Cardinal McCarrick scandal, which reveals that to this day, Catholic bishops are not subject to the Dallas Charter. Third, American culture is at a tipping point that does not seem reversible. In generations preceding millennials, similar forecasts were made regarding shifts in US culture. However, some type of stability seems to have emerged in generations before millennials, particularly around the mid-40s range for people of a particular generation. Getting married, raising children, moving to the suburbs, and purchasing a home, these steps indicated an inflection point. One example of this inflection point would be to look at the 1960s generation of Americans in their late teens and early 20s who protested, partied, and pushed against normative claims in American culture. Today, that generation has stabilized along the trend lines of each generation before it. So why would millennials and younger generations be different? In the simplest of terms, I suggest it's 2 things. First, James Carville's famous words, and then religion. Carville's famous words: it's the economy, stupid, and the disaffiliated, unaffiliated experience. Since the economic collapse of 2008, the recovery in the US has not been across the board. I graduated from college in 2009. Dozens of my classmates who graduated with honors with employable degrees, education, business, finance, psychology, they went more than 18 months without finding full-time employment. Purchasing a home is off the table for most millennials. Stability, at least in terms of economics, is not part of the equation for those under 40 today. Religion is the other major factor that has been exhausted in recent studies of young adults and youth. Topics like the nuns and the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, N-U-N-S, or more recently, explorations of the unaffiliated and disaffiliated, those who never grew up in a tradition and those who have walked away from a tradition, highlight that if millennials and younger generations attend church in 10 to 20 years, they are not returning to their faith. They are arriving for the first time. They would be discovering a faith that was not theirs before in terms of regular engagement in a congregation or a parish. There is validity to American Catholic bishops calling the sacrament of confirmation the sacrament of goodbye. These components of the Catholic Church today, economics and un- or disaffiliation, give a bit of perspective to the present moment by way of the recent past. Now I want to turn by way of the present to begin to think about future possibilities. To pause too much before moving to the history of tomorrow, again with all the caveats from Mantell, I want to circle back to the introduction from Baggett and Maldonado Estrada. It's not as if any one person understands it, American Catholicism, and lives it out the same way all the time or in quite the same way as anyone else. and that churches continue to be vital sites for the making of masculinity. American Catholicism, particularly among young Catholics, is lived out through growing diversity in numerous ecclesial sites, including but not limited to parish churches, or sites for making something, some sort of concrete action. One of the most frustrating things of reading studies or research projects sometimes is how obvious the data or the conclusion is. This conversation could be the same, and so it is helpful to point out the obvious for today. We're not in a parish church. We're not in a diocesan Catholic institution. We are in a physical in-person space and a digital virtual space. In the first version of this talk, I spoke in the Gasper Room at St. Charles Center and the retirement house of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood in rural Ohio, where up until recently in that Ohio County, there was mass offered nearly every half hour from 7 a.m. until 12 p.m. across 20 different parishes. Those 20 parishes served less than 25,000 people. Conversation about the future of the church was extra parochial. I think that points to the future tense and the present tense of the grammar of the American Catholic Church. In 2022, Catholic University of America released a national study of priests and bishops, the first of its kind in more than 50 years. 131 bishops responded along with 3,500 priests. The study found priests reported a very high level of well-being, consistent with other studies that find clergy have the highest level of satisfaction in their career among all job fields. It also found a high degree of burnout among clergy. Those two findings are not really surprising. On the question of whether bishops would help a priest with personal struggle, 92% of bishops said yes. Wondering what that other 8%, who those guys are. Only 36% of priests said yes. The highest response from priests for confidence in a superior came from religious priests, priests of religious orders, still only at 67%. For trust in the bishop in general, priests responded at a rate of 24%, of a 24% confidence rate. The primary crisis in the U.S. Catholic Church is not a generational crisis, but a crisis of trust and confidence in leadership. To repeat, from the events from January 2002 forward, the sex abuse cover-up crisis continues to ripple and ripple again throughout the U.S. Catholic Church. Dioceses are filing for bankruptcy protections. State attorney generals are convening grand juries. Lawsuits continue to be filed. The present moment in the U.S. Catholic Church, and likely into the future, is outside of being under the steeple of cathedrals or basilicas. Bishops, and by extension priests, I think, continue to erode trust and accepted authority from the people in the pews. Religious orders and sites like monasteries, abbeys, retreat centers, and other Catholic institutions, which can optimize their Catholic identity through a particular charism, are to be likely continued centers of American Catholicism. Religious orders and these sites have an opportunity to emphasize a Catholicity that resonates with people in the pew while escaping the messiness under the mitre and formal authority of the diocesan structure of the church. The future of American Catholic Church is somewhere away from the loss of legitimacy of bishops and the post-Boston 2002. A second point of the present and future beyond trust and authority in the Catholic Church is the urbanization of the U.S. and a parallel of the diversification of the U.S. More than 10 years after his book, The Shared Parish, Brett Hoover, my outside reader and a great theologian, revisited the dynamic of multicultural settings in American Catholic parishes. In his article, Still Unaccommodated, Why Are Hispanic Catholics Treated Unequally in So Many U.S. Parishes, Hoover wrote, quote, "More than a decade of researching parish life, and after teaching many cohorts of diverse pastoral ministers, something has become disturbingly clear to me. Institutionalized racial and ethnic inequality, especially of the anti-Hispanic variety, is endemic in Catholic parishes," end quote. Earlier in the shared parish, the adaptation of his dissertation, Hoover outlined optimistic hope for how parishes might bridge cultural differences in fusing a community together in the midst of intercultural sharing, especially the sharing of personal narratives of pain, loss, hope, and joy. Instead, the trend line of a growingly diverse U.S. Catholic Church has not demonstrated a type of merging traffic. Parishes and congregations in the U.S., both Catholic and Protestant alike, are as ethnically divided as when Martin Luther King Jr. appeared on Meet the Press and said that the 10 or 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning was the most segregated hour of the week in the United States. Parallel to the religion segregation 2.0 is the urbanization or the re-urbanization of America. More than half of the United States population lives in 438 counties. Current estimates suggest 83% of the US population lives in urban areas and will increase to 89% by 2050. Metropolitan areas account for more than 90% of US GDP and US wage income. Poverty rates are also lower in metropolitan areas than rural areas, 11% compared to 14%. In terms of Catholic schools, the demographic and economic data on cities track. Urban Catholic schools have stabilized, though inner city, i.e. poor, urban Catholic parishes have languished. The days of the center of the U.S. Catholic Church in a rural county parish are gone. In Los Angeles County alone, there are 3 million Catholics. 3 million in one county. And if the trends hold, Orange County, Diocese of Orange, will be larger than the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Catholic Church is growingly urban and growing in the directions in which the United States is growing. The difficulty posed to the U.S. Catholic Church right now is that as people are moving geographically, economically, and culturally, the physical infrastructure built up to this moment and built up for this moment is not moving with the people. The Archdiocese of Chicago, for example, the restructuring process for parishes throughout the Archdiocese, up to 1/4 of parishes may be closed before 2040. The main driver for this restructuring is not attendance, collection, or even clergy. Large urban dioceses have fewer priests than before due to a large population and a large ecosystem of Catholic institutions to feed into diocesan vocations, along with men and women, religious and urban areas. But the number of clergy is somewhat stable for the work in parishes. The main driver for the restructuring is property. Buildings are no longer in use and yield a significant liability in the Archdiocese of Chicago. If the maxim on buildings and people holds true, which I think it does, buildings serve people, not the other way around, then when people move and the buildings do not, Catholic Church faces a conundrum. Physical buildings also relate to the social and cultural buildings of American society in racial and ethnic cultures. To repeat, the American Catholic Church is diversifying as quickly as American society is diversifying. The U.S. Catholic Church is growingly non-white. We are very, very close to a moment in which dioceses house an office for Hispanic ministries, while more than 50% of the diocese is Latino or Latina. If or when this is the case, a reasonable question emerges if the diocese is first and foremost a white ministry, with a carving out of a minority of the diocese resources for a majority of Catholics in that very diocese. A different direction of buildings other than brick and mortar is what we build up through our actions, particularly in what we make or do as identified by Maldonado Estrada. Years ago, Craig Dykstra and Dorothy Bass, two practical theologians, explored what they described as Christian practices. In a couple of iterations of defining Christian practices, they landed on this. By Christian practices, we mean things people do together over time to address fundamental human needs in response to and in the light of God's active presence for the life of the world. Summarize things done together, thus communal, repetitive in nature, in response and in light to God's presence, and in an attempt to address fundamental human needs. It is important not to miss the forest for the trees as if a focus on Christian practices misses things like institutions, cultures, or policies for individual concrete and specific acts as practices. Christian practices do not happen in a vacuum away from institutions, cultures, or policies. But like the axiom for parishes and buildings, do the buildings serve people, or are people serving the buildings? A focusing of our lens on the practice gives us the opportunity to address what is being done and or not done. One of the things I think is helpful for a conversation about the future of our grandkids' church is the repetitive component of Christian practices. If a practice is repetitive, for example, making a grandparent's cookie recipe, change is requisite in order to maintain a repetition of the practice. I used the wrong chocolate chips last time, or the water temperature from the faucet was too warm. You can see that I like cooking. To keep doing anything in our lives, we make changes, usually very small ones. Farming today is still farming, but there have been significant changes. John Deere tractors come with air conditioning now, let alone GPS-enabled drones for making the precise location of each seed planted. In order to farm today, there have had to be changes to the practice of farming from 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. We've always done it that way is less an epitaph of a dying parish or congregation and more the words of a ghost of a practice that is not practicing anymore. On the church side of change for continuity in and around Christian practices, this squarely hits the institutional church, including but not limited to parishes. Young Americans, including young Catholics, have little to no trust in traditional institutions. For example, through branches of government, schools, large businesses, or corporations. The Catholic elements, which are part of the brand of the institutional church, do not bode well with young adults. Thriving Catholic parishes are described as being different or more welcoming than the impression of a Catholic parish for young adults. There is an oppositional component here, probably more pronounced in the current TLM movement. But to return to the four qualities of Christian practices: communal, repetitive, God's presence, and fundamental human needs, there is not a restriction of only certain locations, institutions, or ordained/gender restrictions on leadership, participation, or degrees of engagement. Our Christian practices continue or persist precisely because they change around these three axes: things done together over time, in response and in light of God's presence, and in an attempt to address fundamental human needs. In light of changes in the U.S. Catholic Church and changes in the United States, an emphasis on Christian practices, I think, provides a way to focus on continuity in the midst of changes. At the same time, the first quality of Christian practices from Dijkstra and Bass, things done together, provide a window to combat the isolationism and heresy of American individualism, while also providing an incredible opportunity at this moment in this church. A multicultural and intergenerational community grows together by doing something together. A simple maintenance model does not address a community of today or tomorrow, though it may address a community of yesterday or yesteryear. A maintenance model closes the window to focus on the doing of something. If the most important thing for a parish is keeping the doors open, what happens inside the doors is secondary at best, if not wholly irrelevant. To summarize the current moment, there are a few points. First, the number of parishes is somewhat stable, declining in some regions and exploding in other regions. Second, the number of clergy is declining, but corresponds effectively to the number of sacraments celebrated. Third, excluding parishes, most Catholic institutions are thriving. Hospitals, schools, universities. At the same time, the Catholic hospitals, schools, and universities struggling are in the same boat as other institutions or neighborhoods in the US. For example, inner city, i.e. poor, Catholic schools serving non-white communities are struggling or closing. Fourth, the church and the country is diversifying rapidly. 5, Leadership in the U.S. Catholic Church from the perspective of the mitre and crozier is struggling to meet this diversity, to meet the challenges after the sex abuse cover-up crisis from Boston 2002 forward. Sixth, leadership in the U.S. Catholic Church from the perspective of lay leadership at thriving Catholic institutions is effective and is ushering in a different angle of authority in the U.S. Catholic Church. If these trajectories hold, will this be the church of our grandkids? If we can expand our view of what counts to be Catholic or to be in the church, then yes. Bill McNamara is right at the beginning that we need to talk about Catholicisms and not Catholicism. If we can be open to the diversity of how to be a part of the church and how to respond to fundamental human needs in our midst, the church will not only persist, but will thrive.
Good evening. I just want to thank Dennis for this invitation to come tonight. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate you all coming out as well. When first asked to present this response and hearing the title, I instantly thought of my own grandmother, Nan, and going to her church. I was one of 5 kids, so any one-on-one attention with my grandmother was a treat. I spent many weekends with her, and Sundays usually started with Mass at Visitation Church in the South Plaza area, followed by an outing to the Plaza Library or lunch at Winstead's and a movie. Because of these anticipated outings, Nan's socializing with seemingly everyone in the whole entire parish after Mass was a true test for a 7-year-old's patience. Though St. Elizabeth's was my home parish growing up, my life circumstances led me to raise my own family in Visitation Parish as well. And I found myself laughing on many occasions at the pain I put on my own children through as I, channeling my grandmother, socialized with seemingly everybody in the parish after Mass. But what I did not realize as a 7-year-old, as I observed my grandmother in parish life, is that I was watching a foundation being poured for me, and invariably for my own children and grandchildren. My grandmother's church, in that sense, is the same church I have now. And there are many indicators that those same foundational elements that she passed to me will still exist for my own grandchildren. I don't have a lot of time to talk about the unique history at Visitation. Some of you might know it, but there was an upstairs Mass and the High Hall Mass, downstairs Mass. This practice halted with the building of the new church so as to house the whole parish. But I mention it because it speaks to the necessity to consider the particularities of local church, especially at the parish level, and the willingness to change when the practice of a community or an entire church needs to change to meet the faith community where they are. In my reflection on Father James' presentation, the local church is what I just kept coming back to again and again. My response has 2 parts. One request to consider an overlooked desire of young Catholics, which is the local consideration that I mentioned. And then a big picture question to further the discussion Father James starts here tonight. In the spirit, there's some questions that will come up, but in his meditation and questions for us, each of my considerations will be through. The priests do this so smoothly with their microphones. I just don't have that much practice with it. So each of my considerations will be through the lens of hope. So first, a quick intro to my CV to position myself as someone who can respond. I believe I was invited to do this response because of my work at a Catholic high school and now in a parish environment. I have a master's degree from Creighton University and spent the 10 years after graduation teaching at St. Teresa's Academy, an all-girls college prep high school in Kansas City and Midtown. I taught theology. I then transitioned to parish work, which is a natural fit, both because of my degree and because of my experience as an active parishioner for the last 20 years. I mentioned teaching at St. Teresa's Academy, a task increasingly more difficult as the Catholic but barely practicing population increased. It was always interesting and amusing, somewhat, that students clearly understood that math or science classes built on each other, and whatever they learned in the 8th grade level, or dare we say at the 2nd grade level, would of course not suffice at the high school level. But many seemed quite content with that when it came to theology. There was an unearned confidence catechetically in their knowledge base, and certainly in theology. There was a lot of eye rolling and grumbling. We already studied this in grade school. But my initial focus when Father James shared his article with me was the idea of the American Catholic. I would invite all of us to consider your own reaction when you hear American Catholic. I myself only knew that distinction in theory from grad school, if I'm being honest, but more concretely, only when I visited churches outside of my own country. This experience was quite different depending on if I was attending masses in Guatemala on service trips or visiting Rome. One major difference is the idea of Catholicism as being more so cultural than necessarily religious. I don't think we see that as much here in America, though there is the rise of the self-identified recovering Catholic. However, I do think the parishioner that Father James mentioned from the Most Holy Redeemer captured it completely, and they conceded the existence of American Catholicism, but rejects the idea that it can be captured in that limiting term. I think Father James' article proves that we almost have to put a qualifier ahead of any American Catholic, such as Midwest, Southern, East Coast, Black, Latinx, etc. Even in Kansas City, we have north of the river Catholics and we have south of the river Catholics. Father James does highlight 3 points that probably does describe most younger American Catholics. They are growing more diverse ethnically and culturally. They are more liberal or progressive than older Catholics, and there is a point of no return on cultural shifts. The first 2 points are probably pretty consistent with our historical experience. For example, the social unrest of the 70s. But the third point to me is the most distressing one. There is no current, strong, stabilizing institution that these young Catholics can turn to as they age. Father James mentioned that quite a bit in his remarks. The church has lost its credibility, if not total relevance to some as well. The government is a mess, and educational institutions are also losing ground. No institution can keep up with the cancellation culture at the speed of the internet. This leads credence to the instability that Father James speaks about. He doesn't mention this, but as an educator, I was faced with almost on the daily, the appalling rising statistics of anxiety, depression, and suicide rates amongst teenagers and young adults. It cannot be a coincidence that those statistics increase while the credibility of our major stabilizing institutions decrease. But let's stay with the church and stay with that hope. 2 groups that are often topics of discussion these days are the nuns, that were mentioned earlier, the NONES, the self-proclaimed non-affiliated, and on the other side of the spectrum, the wave of hyper-conservatives that seem to cling to a church that they did not ever actually know, the phenomena of Weltschmerz. But Father James also mentions a different growing phenomenon that if the young Catholics did come back to church, it will not be a church that they know. I tend to agree with this. As I mentioned before, I experienced in my last few years at St. Teresa's a growing population of unchurched students. The families just don't attend anymore. This is a trend that I continue to see in my new position as a pastoral associate. Mass attendance is down. And in a recent survey, in our own parish, a local survey, an overwhelming number of much older Catholics indicated dismay that the younger Catholics with families were not coming to Mass, and that they wanted them to know that they were missed. As I'm sure rings true with many parish communities, we are seeing the same group of people and they're an aging people at all the events and doing most of the work. Yet, this group is aging or has aged, and the backup team is not ready to come off the bench. However, once again, there's hope. I work with engaged couples now, and many attend Mass only occasionally. This is from self-reporting on a survey that I give them. But across the board, share a desire to raise their families in a parish. Across the board, that is described as part of their own foundational experiences growing up. They clearly understand the value of an active faith life, of being part of the community and raising their kids with ritual and being part of something that's bigger than them. They clearly want the benefits and will even commit to the desire by getting married in the church. They almost all acknowledge a plan to attend Mass more. This has become so automatic and predictable that I've actually been, and kind of somewhat discouraging really, I have been actually pushing back with a "what are you waiting for?" and a gentle reminder that they're asking something of the church and their community that only exists if people, like the parishioners that gave them that experience they desire for their families, are participating at the parish level. So it's time to give back what they received. There's an urgency of now. This desire is not separate from all of the obstacles that Father Smith mentions. And I will kind of personally note it was a very discouraging article to kind of work through at the time. But so the question then is, how does the church meet this perpetual Augustinian desire or restlessness to be in relationship with God for our younger generations? Father James points out that the Christian practice will persist, and it might even be extraparochial. And I agree, but he has also brought us to the threshold. The big question is, what vehicle, meaning what institution, is going to provide this path for our future generations? Will it be religious orders? Do they have the influence or even the geographical stability to do so? Do they have the numbers and the vocations?
Your sound went
How many
out.
Catholics anymore have the exposure to religious orders in which the credibility would be there? Will it be a combination of Catholic educational institutions? Though a combination of the educational institutions, though I find myself dismayed as the institutional church is proving again and again it doesn't believe in that relationship either. We keep hearing of established parishes being moved out of universities and replaces them with the local jurisdiction or the bishop or a local priest. Though looking at Father James' statistical report on the numbers of priests that do not trust their bishops as leaders, that seems unsustainable as well. I am not sure what the answer to this question is. I don't even know if I have to answer it specifically as an American Catholic, but I firmly believe it will continue to have the qualities Father James highlights here. I think the path will still have to and will be communal. I think it will center on ritual. It will be Eucharistic in nature. It will be Eucharistic in nature and practice, and will give sustained hope to the human condition. I feel that in addition, there will be an increased inclusivity dynamic and social component. The young Catholics I speak about will demand this. And lastly, I anticipate that at some celebration of it, I myself will have a grandchild or two, impatiently waiting while I delay our planned Sunday outing as I socialize with seemingly everyone in my community. But as I did with my grandma, Nan, and my kids did with me, my kids will also be observing and learning. Thank you.
At this time, for those on Zoom, we're going to send you into breakout rooms for discussion. Hopefully you receive the discussion questions in advance as a PDF. For those here in the room, I would invite you at your small tables. If you're at a table of one or two, I would invite you to join another table. You can talk to yourself, but it's more enjoyable to talk to more than one or two other folks. These questions are just guiding questions. Feel free to discuss whatever you would like to discuss from what we have presented this evening. Like about 10 minutes.
Okay, I think we're ready to start question, answer, and sharing. If you remember, people in the room, if you want to speak, raise your hand, speak to the mic, hold it up like an ice cream cone like this. So you're speaking directly into it. Don't hold it down here like this or like this. Keep it up here like this, please.
Some good directions. Yeah. I think we'd be open also to hear about, so any questions that you might have, but then also if anything came up in the discussions that you had too. So if anyone wants to share that as well.
Please wait for a microphone.
Yeah. Wait for your ice cream cone.
I'm just curious to know, when you were saying about California and all the Catholics there, is that because the Latino influence there and so many have come to California? Or, because I don't think of California as being real Catholic, other than when the missions were started.
A couple of things I could go on for 2 hours on this. The first is, it's a presidential election year, so we're seeing maps constantly. If you look at maps, like electoral maps over the past, even just 20 years, you see the numbers have changed. Certain states have lost congressional seats because populations have moved out. Other states have increased. California is just growing number of people there, both in terms of people being born in California and also people moving to California. There are a ton of people leaving California, moving out. There are even more being born and moving in. So California is still growing. Among immigrants, the data shows, I think it's about 90% of all immigrants in the United States currently are Catholic. That includes East Asian Pacific, that includes Central American. That's not just Latino. It's also elsewhere in the world. So it's not just that. But Los Angeles County, 3 million Catholics. That's just an epicenter. And the church continues to grow and grow. There's some dioceses that are adding like 10 parishes every year, just of the growth. There's also tremendous growth. Carolinas, St. James and Charlotte is now the largest Catholic parish in the United States. Over 10,000 families at that one parish. Charlotte, North Carolina. Parishes in Texas continue to grow there as well. One of the great things with these growing parishes, bishops are not allowing parishes to be built on every street corner. They're building one parish for one town, for one area. And as the population grows, they just get a bigger building or they have multiple buildings. So we're not falling into the hazard of Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Florida, of a church every 3 blocks.
He's not kidding about the 2 hours thing because we meant to kind of chat about this and 2.5 hours later, I'm like, oh, yeah, I felt really bad about that because I kind of talked to him for longer too. So
Graduate students, so I can just do that all day. I'm also full of
and I missed
absolutely
school.
useless information.
Yeah.
Hoosiers tend to do that.
So we kind of nerded out on the theology. So
Don't get me started on the high school state
Dennis?
series for Indiana for all sports.
I want to thank both of you. Your talks have been extremely interesting and information. I think you haven't answered, but you've made me aware of why there are so many young people, including our own personal children, asking myself constantly why so many of the young people not participating in the church. But you've answered some of the questions, but I hope somehow the church as a whole, the bishops can realize that we aren't offering what the young people are looking for. And we are going to be willing to change. So thank you so much.
Can I ask a follow-up part B to that question? And because what I have heard is that, a movement back to a more traditional practice of Catholicism, that's the salvation. What are you seeing in that? I
think there is, we were just talking about this at our table, and I think that stability, the instability that we were talking about, it's a quick fix for stability. Do you want to tell your do you mind sharing what you said? Because I thought it was a good metaphor for it.
The metaphor of the coloring book.
Yeah.
When I was fifth grade in Vatican II, 65. In the early years, we had coloring books with lines. And when we colored, we knew we were in the line or outside the line. Thinking of the Baltimore Catechism, okay, we knew we were in line or out of line. And then my younger siblings who were born after Vatican II, they got coloring books without lines. And so they had to draw the lines and then color, and it was kind of confusing. So that's why they wanted a church with the lines,
Yeah.
old lines.
And I just think that we're seeing that. I think that we're seeing that reaction to a lot of instability, and they're looking for the leadership, and they're looking for, and they're not finding it. And so that concern, they had the lines, and at the time, and I think that's attractive, and it's safe, and it's comfortable. Even teaching at a high school, you can see, there's just a need for the boundaries, right? And then, they get unmoored, and then they make, bad decisions, and they want them. And I mean, this is just basic, even if you're raising kids, they need the structure. They need to know what they're pushing up against. Even if they're rebelling, they need to know what they're rebelling against, right? So I think part of it is that. I know it's kind of a trite answer. I mean,
I think stability is a big part of it. I think it's also important to remember the contribution of contextual theology, that all theology is done within a context, and all theology is preceded by practice. Practices shape theology. So all practices are embedded in a specific culture. And so my take around the traditionalism-ish in the United States around practice, TLM Mass, TLM practices, is as the US and the US Catholic Church is diversifying rapidly, these kind of movements provide an opportunity to be somewhat insulated and to go back to a specific time of a practice which is very exclusively white. And so when a pastor throws the hymnal out and only permits Gregorian chant and only music written from 19th century, the 18th century Europeans, and doesn't go back to liturgical practices from North Africa, Eritrea, from the mystic Christians in India. It's very exclusive of which tradition counts for the traditionalism. And in the midst of a loss of the white majority in the church and in society, this provides a very, very safe space for encapsulating whiteness.
I'm going to say this carefully too, because I didn't really prep for this, and I'm going to be careful when I say it, but there's also, as we look at psychology, and there's certain models that talk about development, adolescent development, human development, there's also spiritual development. And one of the things I noticed as a teacher, I mean, there's some truth to that. The kids thought, I've already done this in grade school, right? Like, why am I studying this now? I'm like, because you're not in grade school anymore. You're 16. Your 16-year-old is a very different experience than when you were in second grade or whatever. And I did a lot of convincing of that. But there are a lot of people that kind of finish their theological study, or even they're studying their faith at certain, if they didn't go to a Catholic school, then it was, very young. And they don't go back and learn their faith as adults either. So they're meeting their faith spiritually as adolescents, or even, younger than that. And so I think part of it is that as well. So.
I just wanted to say that, yes, the church is going to go through changes because our world is going through changes. However, this isn't the first time in world history that we've had radical changes. In the words of St. Bruno, as the world changes, the cross stands fast. So at what point do we change for the people, but keep the written in stone part of Catholicism? Did I say that? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the overall question, right? I mean, I think probably at some level we get that, but how is that, what's that going to look like, and how is that going to be? And what are we comfortable?
Bingo Sunday nights. We keep the bingo and the fish fries, and we don't.
Yeah.
But also those things are as Catholic as other Catholic practices are too.
Mhm.
Let me read a comment in the chat box from our Zoom folks here. It says, I don't find those retro people, including priests, looking for community, but rather for a quasi mystical relationship with God beyond people and things. Devotions may be done together, but not actually be communal. The US culture has been losing its sense of community for decades already, as documented by sociologists. People nest into their own nuclear families and careers rather than neighborhoods and ethnic groups. Catholics in the pew seem not to know that the words of Scripture comes from communities, or that doctrines are created by historical communities and will change.
The one thing I would add to that comment is popular religious practices, which were kind of decried shortly after Vatican II, was largely contextual, and Latinx theologians woke up theologians to the relevance of them. Popular religious practices have as a root a communal act. They are not primarily an individual act. It's a uniquely American approach to see these acts in an individual devotional way. So individual piety isn't at the root of popular religious practices. They were fundamentally and are fundamentally communal practices of a community, largely extra-clerical in many ways.
I remember a personal experience. I was talking to somebody and she was telling me about a church that she went to. And she said, and it's the parish, but she said, you know, we go to daily mass and we're together. She goes, but I don't need to know anybody's names. That's not important. She goes, it's what's important is just that we're there together just for the Eucharist. And she may have as well been speaking, you know, I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, it just never made any sense to me. And so the communal part always made sense to me as a Catholic. And so this individual, it didn't, and it has, you know, and it is a growing, I mean, the adoration, all the growing things. And I really had to work as a, you know, as a pastoral associate to meet people there too, and to try to understand that, because it was really not what I understood. And so kind of finding that, having those conversations and figuring out what people need from that as they rise, but also then explaining it is communal. I mean, our faith is communal. It's community. It's community based. It's Eucharist. It's coming together. So,
Brother James, you mentioned in your presentation, if I remember correctly, that there are 23,000 less priests now than there were in 1985. I believe I was out of that. Two questions about that. I guess, is some of that contributed to, or could be attributed to, the Boston thing that you talked about, or is it just demographics? And you mentioned, and I believe you said you were born in 84, which makes you 40. And I got to tell you, you're one of the youngest priests I know right now. And so literally the priesthood, the demographics of the priesthood is getting older and older and older. So again, the first part is the demographics. I mean, the Boston thing is dropping numbers, or now to carry on with that, then what, if anything, is the church doing to either recruit and, even more importantly, retain priests nowadays?
I think the current number of priests reflects a particularly unique component in American history, or at least American Catholic history. The Depression and shortly after created a boom in high school seminaries. When we had seminaries within the precious-led community up into the mid-70s, were mostly full. Brennerdale over in Canton, Ohio had a swimming pool. And so kids wanted to go to Brennerdale because at least I might be a priest, but I'm going to have a swimming pool at the high school I go to. We had a priest who taught at St. Joe College, Father Dominic Gerlach, who was sent to the high school seminary because he was one of about a dozen kids at home, and his mom wasn't able to feed all the kids at home. And she said, well, at least my son will get 3 square meals a day and a good education. We had a unique window in American Catholic history of this surge of the number of priests. The biggest loss, I think, isn't post-Boston 2002, it's post-Vatican II. There were a lot of priests who left to get married, from religious orders, from dioceses. The instability of the 60s is similar to the instability of today in a lot of ways. And so we have this unique thing of the average age is around 73, 74 of clergy in the United States, right at retirement age. And so we're losing, and we're not getting to a replacement rate. We won't be at a replacement rate until 2050. For dioceses that have full seminaries, they will not hit a replacement rate until 2050. In terms of recruitment or retention, obviously the trust from priests and their bishops is a retention issue right now. And there's also an issue of retention of a shift in the a cultural shift, and this very black and white thinking, which sort of created many problems before Vatican II as well. The church in the 1930s and 1940s didn't do so well with things related to clergy or controversy. I think the financial issues are going to be as big, if not bigger, than the sex abuse cover-up crisis, of how we expect priests or bishops to spend money, and they might not be doing so. So retention, I think, is an issue there. Recruitment, I think now in about the third wave of co-workers in the vineyard from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, I don't think it's fair to think about ordained ministry in the context of just ordained ministry. I think it's most helpful to look at ordained ministry in the context of ministry, which includes looking at professional lay ministry. Even a priest at a parish is working mostly with lay ministers. Father Jim Basic talked about ministry as a priest as being a minister to ministers, rather than being a direct minister to parishioners themselves. I don't think we can address sacramental ministry unless we address ministry in general. And we're kind of shying away from professional ministry as well. There's not massive work on retention and recruitment in professional ministry. So I think the two go hand in hand. I also think you get to good priests by having good lay folks who shape and form the person to work effectively with people in the pews. In our own community, we have a surge of vocations in sub-Saharan Africa, in East Asia Pacific. Where the church is growing, we're seeing growth in the number of ordinations there as well. There's a growth in lay ministry out of there as well, but there's not as much of a concentrated effort of formation for lay ministry there the way there was in the US in the 1970s and 1980s.
So I have a question and comment. So my question is with the decline in priests, are we seeing an increase in deacons?
There is a growth statistically across the board. I think there are still a few dioceses that have not rolled out formations for permanent deacons. As bishops have rolled out permanent deacons, I'm not sure that any bishop who instituted a program also instituted a program of financially supporting those permanent deacons for their entire ministry the way that they would for clergy, which historically is an issue. If you ordain someone, you have to support them. So ordaining someone as a deacon and not offering financial support for them, there's a problem there. There's also been just substantial work and discernment among women deacons in the Catholic Church. The current study at the Vatican, I had the privilege at CTU to sit next to a woman who was called by her parish in the Archdiocese of Chicago to be a permanent deacon, which is still in an ongoing process through the Archdiocese and the Vatican. So there is an uptick there. The biggest uptick, I think, has been where the church is growing globally in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And even there, it's been very slow, but in areas where they have permitted it, it's grown tremendously.
And then my comment is, I think a lot of, and I deal with a lot of younger generation just because of my profession. And we talk about religion on occasion, and a lot of them seem to feel conflicted about the Catholic Church because they feel like we are conforming to society rather than holding ground. So I thought that that was interesting coming from different, and they're people of different religions and such. And I just thought that that was something that we really need to be thinking about, because I do feel we definitely are trying to conform. And I'm sorry, the reason I'm Catholic is because I know what to expect. I know what my expectations are from the Bible, from our teachings, from all of these different things. And if younger generation is seeing that, it's not stable.
Zoom folks, you want to chime in?
I don't hear much about the Synod in the United States, but do you think that some of the ideas that are coming out of the Synod would help, one, the point that was brought up about being more relevant to younger generations, and two, addressing some of the needs for lay ministers in the church?
I think the rollout of the preparation for the Synod in the United States is a great reflection of where the U.S. Catholic Church is right now. It was fragmented. In some dioceses, bishops enthusiastically rolled out listening sessions, participated in listening sessions themselves, demanded that every single Catholic parish participate. In other dioceses, it wasn't that. And so the preparation for the Synod reflected how non-synodal or partially synodal the U.S. Catholic Church is through the structure of bishops. I think the engagement at the Synod from lay folks, from religious, from priests, from bishops, reflects the current moment so much better from where a majority of the church is in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia Pacific, where the issues and concerns they're addressing, we tend to not address as much in a privileged and white dominant church here in the US. I also think the role of lay ministry in the church in the global South looks a little bit different than it does in the US. There's not quite a sort of clericalism of lay ministry there as there sort of is at times in the US. I think the approach of listening more and accompaniment more and not running to conclusions really quickly really reflects the influence of Selam on Pope Francis and on this synodal approach. However, there are issues, there are topics that don't give way to simply accompaniment, but really do demand a specific reaction, specific action immediately. Abuse in the church is one of those. Violence in our society is one of those. There are some things that can't really spin around in circles in listening sessions for 20 years before arriving at something.
Right.
I think to kind of going back and circling back, when we talk about the American church and being in the American church, and I used to tell my students this too, they thought whatever they were feeling or wanting or whatever should be how it is for everybody, right? And I would have to remind them, I said, if you're sitting at the Pope's desk, he has a lot of things on top of there. He's got a lot of people. So people in the world and the places that you mentioned are not thinking like we are or talking about what we, you know, they're dealing with other stuff too. And so somehow we have to manage all of those conversations in the Catholic Church as well. And so I think I think we do have some self-centeredness as a country in which we think
Right.
we have this major influence on the entire Catholic Church and we are just a small part.
I have two comments.
Hey.
To kind of follow up what you were saying, I helped with. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. To follow up on what you were saying, I helped with the confirmation classes this last year at my parish. And we had some sessions where we were talking to the kids. Now, these, you know, at this time they were high school freshmen. And I was surprised at how many of them have very traditional views of how they see the church, how they want the church. More than one said they like the idea of kneeling at the communion rail. And I said, oh boy, I thought I was the only one that liked it, and I'm old, you know? So, but I think maybe it's swinging back the other way a little bit, in time, and then the other thing about, we have to realize that other parts, Catholics around the globe don't necessarily want what we want. This statistic has some age to it, but, because I believe it's lower now. But at one point, which was in the last 10 years, the United States Catholics represent 6% of the world's Catholics. So 6% want this and that and the other thing, but the other 94% of the world, they don't necessarily like that, So it does have to be, because the word Catholic means open to all, so it does have to be across the board, global. Yeah, global. I'll stop talking.
I'm when there's a lot of change like there is right now, then people scatter in all directions because it's really kind of frightening. But there's fundamental things that every human craves. And I think if our church got back to those basic cravings, there's just a few: acceptance, community, finding peace, meaning, and suffering. If they communicated how Catholicism helped them with that, then we could all have our differences, but those common cravings would hold it together.
I think that's true. I think that's something, a part of religion in addressing fundamental meaning. I also think from a Christian perspective, it's not just meaning in general. From a Christian perspective, those who are at the margins, those who are on the underside of the ship matter. Preferential option for the poor is a part of a Christian vision of the church and of society. And in the US, we've lost the poor in our parishes. The poorest folks in our society aren't able to be a part of the community on Sunday if they're working multiple gigs. Ask any server at Bob Evans on a Sunday what good the poorest folks in Catholic members don't have access to the parish on Sundays. Those through our food pantry or through our soup kitchens are more of people parishes serve rather than we're serving ourselves as part of our community now. There's some really good studies around blue letter laws on Sunday work related to that. Any other comments or questions?
I don't see how would they not have access to go to church? The church is a building, just like a grocery store, just like a restaurant, just like the homeless shelter, food pantry. Their church, if they're homeless and they're unemployed, assuming they're unemployed, which they might not be, if they're unemployed, there's buses that run 24/7 in a lot of places. Some places they don't. I just don't understand how.
The article that's the best reference for this is from America, which is now, I think, 6 or 8 years old, about how the poor are absent in our pews. All the demographic studies of parishioners in average Catholic parishes today show that the poorest folks in that geographic area are not showing up on Sunday in the communities. Economically, for those who have to work on Sundays, who have to work weekends, weekend mass schedule doesn't fit for that. I think it's also in the sense of building community or of building the social ties of what draws us together in the pews. Catholic parishes today are not as multicultural as the geographic area in which they live. My first assignment was in rural Ohio, where at least 3 major businesses are recruiting exclusively from Latin America to bring up people to work because local folks don't want to work there. The outreach to the Hispanic community in the area by the parish is to put 10 missalettes in Spanish at the back of the church, and that's it. And we had more than 100 Spanish-speaking families inside of our 5 parishes. Catholic parishes today are as racially segregated as they were 60 years ago. And so even if doors are technically open, even if things are accessible in terms of a parking lot or a bus schedule, the way we network together isn't necessarily reflective of that openness or that accessibility.
That just triggered for me that in our diocese, there are folks in the city who feel like the churches that have ministered to Black and Brown people have closed disproportionately. And is there anything in your research that validates that or speaks to that, points in a direction that's helpful in regard to that?
My weekend from 2 weeks ago points in that direction. I had a mission appeal on the south side of Chicago, and the visiting priest Saturday night said, because of the restructuring in Chicago, there are now 6 Black Catholic parishes, the entire south side of Chicago. A lot of the Midwest restructuring of parishes have disproportionately affected Black Catholic parishes. I was really struck by what the then pastor of Old St. Pat's said when they started that restructuring. Old St. Pat's was a parish that, according to the myth, got down to 4 families and also got down to exactly 12 people at the first Holy Thursday Mass that Jack Wall had as pastor. They're now at 6,000 families covering 200 different zip codes. And he said, if we had started restructuring at that time, this parish would have been closed. So we have to rethink something differently about opening or closing parishes just based on numbers. Because places where vitality has popped up didn't correspond with what had to happen in terms of demography at that time. I think economically, non-white Catholic communities are disproportionately affected by diocesan structure. The structure of bishops, the structure of clergy, demographically does not reflect where the U.S. Catholic Church is in terms of Black Catholics, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. 10% of the U.S. Catholic Church is African American. We don't have 10% of the bishops are Black. We don't have 10% of clergy who are Black. So we have a lack of representation in terms of ordained clergy. In terms of lay ministry, we're not exactly there. But also in lay ministry, we have more women leading than men. Which is not a bad thing.
20 going to 30% of the priests and parishes are now people of color, but they're from other countries.
Yeah.
The U.S. now is the #1 place for missionary priests from outside the United States.
Or a missionary.
Which is both a wonderful thing in terms of engaging intercultural. It's also a terrible thing if we center leadership only on clergy and we're not looking at lay leadership as legitimate.
This was, you had brought this up in my reflection, I took it out of my notes, but I was thinking about my kids and thinking about what I was raised with lay leadership. And you know, Peg Eckert's here, and she was a huge influence on me and my decision to go into ministry. But I think that it probably would surprise me that there might be many, many areas in the country that do not have that. And if we're not forming lay ministry and forming lay leaders and having good formation in that, it's going to be a real issue. So I feel very grateful for that. So, but I think that I might be unique in that in our diocese too. So.
I think we should probably come to a close here today. James, Jennifer, Jenny, thank you very much for coming again. The session tonight was recorded, and so it will be online. I'll put it on our website along with the text of the talks and the slideshow. So if you want to come back and look at this stuff again, it will be available. Give me until next week to get it all done, but we'll get it up on the website. All right. Thank you all very much. Good night.